90 days. That is all the time we are looking at. 90 days of American soil, American skies, and American coastlines absorbing one catastrophic event after another. And when you lay them out side by side, when you actually plot them on a map and watch the timeline unfold, something shifts in your gut. This is not a list of random bad luck. This is a pattern, and patterns by definition mean something. Let us start at the beginning of the window we tracked. In early spring, a sprawling storm system stalled over the Central Plains and refused to move. Meteorologists watching the radar described it as behaving in ways that did not match their models. The storm sat. It rotated slowly. It dumped. Towns in Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee recorded rainfall totals in a matter of hours that historically would have taken an entire month to accumulate. Rivers that had not flooded in living memory crested their banks. Bridges that had stood since the Eisenhower administration washed out overnight. The death toll from that single event reached into the dozens before the water receded. But here is the detail that kept investigators awake. The atmospheric river that fed that storm originated in the Pacific, travelled overland in a configuration that meteorologists described as increasingly anomalous, and connected directly to sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico that were running several degrees above what they should have been for that time of year. The ocean was hotter than it was supposed to be. The storm drank from it. And entire communities paid the price. 2 weeks later, while cleanup crews were still pulling debris from riverbanks in Kentucky, a different kind of disaster was organising itself off the southeastern coastline. A low-pressure system that almost every forecast model had predicted would fall apart and dissipate instead tightened. It intensified in less than 36 hours from a disorganised cluster of thunderstorms into a coherent tropical system. Rapid intensification is the term meteorologists use. They've been using it more and more frequently over the past several years, and the reason they keep using it comes back to that same overheated ocean water. Warm water is fuel. More warm water is more fuel. The physics are not complicated. This system made landfall along the Georgia coast during a high tide window that amplified the storm surge by nearly 4 additional feet. Coastal communities that had been told they sat outside the worst-case zone found themselves under 6 feet of salt water. The timing mattered. The combination of factors mattered. And in disaster science, when multiple unlikely factors converge at the same moment, researchers have a name for that too. They call it compounding. The events are not independent. They reinforce each other. 3 days after that storm, wildfires ignited in the Texas Panhandle under conditions that fire behavior analysts described as extreme: low humidity, high winds, drought-baked grasses and scrubland that had been drying out for months before the first spark. The fires moved faster than any recorded in the historical database for that region. Fire crews who had fought blazes in that area for decades said they had never seen fire travel the way it travelled during those days. It outran equipment, it jumped fire breaks, it consumed ranch land and structures across a geographic footprint that took days to fully map from the air. And then, before the smoke had fully cleared over Texas, the upper Midwest recorded a late-season cold snap that broke century-old temperature records in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and both Dakotas. Pipes burst. Power grids strained under heating demand that the infrastructure had not been designed to handle. Livestock operations lost animals by the thousands to exposure. The agricultural damage from that event alone ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. 4 distinct disasters in 4 different regions, 4 different hazard types: flooding, tropical intensification, wildfire, extreme cold, in less than 30 days. If you're waiting for a breath, there is not one coming. Because the 90-day window we're examining does not slow down, it accelerates. Roughly 5 weeks into our tracking period, a derecho swept across the Ohio Valley. A derecho is a line of severe thunderstorms that moves in a roughly straight path and produces wind damage comparable to a weak tornado, but spread across a corridor hundreds of miles long rather than a narrow track. The derecho that hit in this window travelled more than 600 miles from Indiana to western Pennsylvania in under 12 hours. Power lines came down across a 4-state region. Roughly 2.5 million people lost electricity. For many of them, that outage lasted 2 weeks, in summer heat, without air conditioning. Heat-related illness hospitalizations in cities along that corridor spiked dramatically in the days that followed the power outages. Emergency managers noted that the derecho had effectively converted an infrastructure event into a public health event. The storm knocked out the cooling systems, the heat killed the people, two hazards chained together, compounding again. The pattern is not subtle once you start looking for it. Around the same time the Ohio Valley was recovering from the derecho, the western United States was entering what climate scientists had been warning about for at least a decade. Not a heat wave in the traditional sense, something that the researchers now refer to more precisely as a heat dome, a high-pressure system that traps hot air over a region and refuses to let it escape. The dome settled over Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and parts of California, and simply sat there, as the storm had sat over the Central Plains weeks earlier. Phoenix recorded consecutive days above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Parts of Death Valley flirted with all-time world records. Hikers died in national parks. Elderly residents in cities with inadequate cooling infrastructure died in their homes. Farm workers in California's Central Valley collapsed in fields. The human cost was severe, but the infrastructure damage was just as alarming to engineers watching the data. Roads buckled, rail lines warped. Power transformers that are not designed to operate continuously at peak load in extreme ambient temperatures began to fail. The grid in parts of Arizona came within hours of a cascading failure that would have cut power to millions of people already living in life-threatening heat. Grid operators made emergency calls to neighboring states. Industrial customers were asked to curtail usage. It held, barely, but engineers who analysed the event afterward made clear that the margin was far thinner than anyone with responsibility for that infrastructure should be comfortable with. Now we are roughly halfway through the 90-day window. Let us take a moment and actually look at what the pattern is telling us, because this is where the picture becomes something you cannot unsee. Every one of these events, the stalled storm system, the rapidly intensifying tropical system, the extraordinary wildfire behaviour, the anomalous late cold snap, the derecho, the heat dome, every single one of them was made more severe, more likely or more destructive by the same underlying condition. The planet is warmer than it has ever been in recorded human history. We crossed a threshold in terms of global average temperature over the past 2 years that scientists had been pointing to for decades as the point where cascading consequences would become unavoidable. We crossed it, and what we are watching now in these 90 days is what the other side of that threshold looks like in practice. This is not a political statement. It is a physics statement. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air. More moisture in the atmosphere means more water available to fall as catastrophic precipitation. Warmer ocean surfaces provide more energy to storm systems. More energy in storm systems produces more rapid intensification. Dry landscapes absorbing years of additional heat become more flammable. Persistent high-pressure systems, when surrounded by a warmer atmospheric background, stall more effectively and last longer. None of this is speculative. It is observed, measured, documented and replicated in every major research database on the planet. The pattern in our 90 days is the signature of that warming. It is what the physics looks like when applied to real geography at real timescales. But let us continue through the window, because there is more. In week 7, the Pacific Northwest experienced an atmospheric river event, that same type of persistent moisture pipeline that had initiated the spring flooding. But this time the target was the Cascade Range in Washington and Oregon. An extraordinary volume of rain fell on ground that was already saturated from earlier precipitation. The rain falling on saturated ground does not absorb. It runs, it collects, it accelerates down slopes. Landslides triggered across multiple counties. A state highway that served as the only road access to 3 small mountain communities disappeared under 200,000 tons of debris in less than 20 minutes. The communities were effectively cut off for 11 days while heavy equipment worked to clear the road. No one died in those slides by what rescue workers described as remarkable fortune. The timing, the location, the specific geometry of the failures all happened to avoid direct strikes on occupied structures. But the near-miss quality of the event was a source of sober reflection among emergency planners in the region. The conditions that produced those slides were not exceptional. They were conditions that climate projections had been predicting would become routine in the Pacific Northwest by mid-century. The projections appear to be running ahead of schedule. The following week brought something to the Gulf Coast that illustrates a different dimension of the pattern. A tropical system made landfall in Louisiana. Moderate intensity, not the catastrophic upper-end storm that emergency managers most fear. But the damage it caused was disproportionate to its category, for a reason that infrastructure analysts have been raising alarms about for years. Much of the coastal protection infrastructure along that stretch of the Gulf, the levees, the pump stations, the surge barriers, was designed and built to withstand conditions that reflected the climate of the middle 20th century. Not the climate of today, not the climate of a warmer Gulf producing more energetic storm surges. Not a coastline that has subsided in some places by several feet since those structures were built. A moderate storm in 2025 can produce damage that a moderate storm in 1975 could not because storms have gotten stronger in that category range, but because the baseline the storm is operating against has shifted. Higher sea levels mean storm surge reaches further inland. Warmer water means the rain bands embedded in even moderate systems can be more intense. Subsided land means areas that were once safely above the waterline are now not. The storm did not have to be a monster. The landscape had already been changed enough that a moderate event was sufficient. This is one of the most important concepts in modern disaster science, and one of the least understood by the general public. We tend to measure disasters by their intensity at the moment of occurrence. Category 4, hurricane. Magnitude 6.8 earthquake. 100-year flood. But those metrics say nothing about the vulnerability of the system being struck. A Category 2 hurricane hitting a healthy, intact coastal wetland buffer with robust infrastructure is a different event, with different consequences than a Category 2 hurricane hitting a subsided, infrastructure-degraded coastline with compromised storm barriers. Same storm, completely different disaster. The Gulf Coast event in Week 8 of our window was the latter, and it will not be the last. Week 9 of the 90-day period brought something that forced meteorologists to reach for their records: a late-season tornado outbreak across the Mid-South, in a region and at a time of year that historically had not been associated with significant tornado activity. Mississippi, Alabama, and western Tennessee were hit by a series of tornadoes over 2 consecutive days. The Storm Prediction Center had issued warnings, and those warnings saved lives. But the geographic and temporal distribution of the outbreak, where it happened and when it happened, sat at the edge of what the models had been designed to anticipate. Tornado climatology is changing. The traditional tornado alley, centered historically on the southern plains, appears to be shifting and expanding eastward. Research published over the past several years has documented this trend with increasing confidence. The southeastern United States, with its higher population density and more complex terrain, is experiencing more tornado activity than historical records would predict. And critically, many of the older housing structures in that region were not built to the wind-resistant standards that newer construction in the traditional tornado alley typically requires. Different building codes, different vulnerability, same deadly result when the storms arrive. 10 people died in that outbreak, in Week 9. The final weeks of the 90-day window we tracked brought events that, in any normal historical moment, would have dominated news coverage and policy discussion for months. A marine heat wave off the coast of Florida produced water temperatures in parts of the Florida Keys and the Gulf that exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures that corals cannot survive. Temperatures that are closer to what you would find in a bathtub than in a healthy marine ecosystem. The bleaching event that followed was catastrophic in scope. Researchers who had been monitoring these reefs for decades describe what they saw as the worst die-off in the recorded history of Florida's coral system. The reefs matter not only ecologically but practically. Coral reefs function as natural wave barriers. They absorb energy from storm surge and wave action that would otherwise strike the coast directly. When reefs die, that protection disappears. The coastline becomes more vulnerable. Future storms arrive against a shore stripped of one of its natural defences. The marine heat wave was not just an environmental event. It was infrastructure damage. It was a reduction in the coastal protection capacity of a state that will face more intense storms as long as the underlying conditions driving those storms remain unchanged. In the final days of our 90-day tracking window, the Pacific coast experienced an earthquake sequence centered off the coast of northern California and southern Oregon. Moderate in magnitude, not a catastrophic rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone that geologists have long identified as the source of a potential future megaquake. But the sequence served as a reminder, because this story is not only about the climate-linked disasters, The planet has always been geologically active. Earthquakes and volcanic events operate on their own timescales, independent of the temperature of the atmosphere. But the compounding principle applies here too. A society stressed by repeated climate disasters, with infrastructure that has been weakened by a succession of extreme weather events, with emergency management agencies that have been operating at sustained high tempo for years, with budgets stretched by recovery costs from the previous disaster before the next one begins, that society faces a geological event from a position of reduced resilience. The vulnerability is cumulative. The damage from any individual event is shaped by the condition of the system absorbing it. And the system has been absorbing a great deal. So here is where we stand after 90 days. Flooding in the Central Plains and the Pacific Northwest, rapid tropical intensification in the southeast, extraordinary wildfire behavior in Texas, anomalous cold in the upper Midwest, a derecho and subsequent public health crisis in the Ohio Valley, a heat dome threatening grid stability in the southwest, landslides cutting off communities in the Cascades, infrastructure defeating storm surge on the Gulf Coast, an expanded tornado outbreak in the Mid-South, a coral catastrophe off Florida, and an earthquake sequence reminding the West Coast of the geological forces operating beneath everything else. That is the 90-day window. That is the pattern. Now comes the question that matters most. What does the pattern mean for what comes next? The scientists who study these systems, the climate researchers, the infrastructure engineers, the public health specialists, the emergency management professionals, they are not pessimists by training. They deal in data and probability. And the data says that the conditions producing this pattern are not temporary. They are not going to reverse themselves on a timescale that is meaningful for planning purposes. The atmospheric and oceanic changes that are driving the clustering and intensification of disasters we observed in our 90-day window took decades to build. They will persist, and they will likely intensify further over decades to come. This means the question is not whether events like these will continue to happen. They will. The question is whether the systems, the infrastructure, the institutions, the communities, the financial mechanisms, the warning networks, the emergency response capacity, whether all of those things will be adequate to absorb what is coming. In some places and in some dimensions, the answer is yes. The United States has among the best weather warning systems in the world. The improvements in tornado warning lead times over the past 20 years have measurably reduced the death toll from tornado outbreaks, even as the outbreaks themselves have expanded geographically. The science of flood prediction has advanced substantially. Evacuation systems for hurricanes have improved. These are real achievements that translate directly into lives preserved. In other dimensions, the gap between what is needed and what exists is growing faster than the will to close it. The aging condition of America's electrical grid is a critical vulnerability that has been documented in study after study without generating commensurate investment. The design standards for coastal infrastructure in flood-prone regions have not kept pace with observed sea level rise. The building codes in the expanding tornado risk zones of the southeast do not reflect the current hazard environment. The wildfire-urban interface, the places where housing development has expanded into landscapes with high fire risk, continues to grow, placing more people and more structures in the path of fires that are becoming more frequent and more extreme. The pattern in the 90 days we tracked is not a warning that something bad might happen. It is documentation that something is already happening. The disasters are not arriving one at a time in neat sequence, allowing full recovery before the next one begins. They are arriving in clusters, in waves, in sequences where the recovery from one event is interrupted by the onset of the next. The bodies of water that produce these storms are not cooling down. The atmospheric conditions that drive these extreme events are not moderating. Resilience, in engineering, and in ecology and in society, refers to the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and return to function. The question that the 90-day pattern forces us to ask is whether the American system, in its current state, with its current investment levels and institutional capacities and political will, has the resilience to absorb what the pattern is telling us is coming. That is not a question with a comfortable answer. But it is the right question, because the pattern is undeniable. The events are documented, the connections are measured, the underlying physics is settled. What happens next depends on what we choose to do with what the pattern is telling us. The 90 days are over. The next 90 have already begun. What comes next is not a continuation of the disaster log. The 90 days have been documented. The pattern has been named. What comes next is the harder question. Why does this keep surprising us? Because it does keep surprising us. Every time one of these events unfolds, the coverage follows the same arc. The dramatic footage of the floodwaters rising, the aerial shots of the fire perimeter, the interviews with shell-shocked survivors standing in front of what used to be their homes, and then, invariably, the moment where someone in authority steps in front of a microphone and describes what just happened as unprecedented. Once in a generation, a 500-year event, language that frames each disaster as an isolated anomaly, a tragic but essentially random occurrence that could not have been predicted or prevented. That framing is not accidental, and it is worth understanding why it persists, because the persistence of that framing is itself part of the story. There is a field of research, relatively young, called attribution science. It is the scientific discipline that studies the relationship between individual extreme weather events and the larger climate changes driving them. Before attribution science developed its current methods, scientists were cautious about connecting any single storm or fire to the background warming of the planet. They would say things like, "Climate change makes such events more likely, but we cannot say it caused this particular event." That caution was scientifically appropriate. It was also, in practical terms, a gift to anyone who preferred not to talk about the connection. Attribution science has changed that conversation significantly. Researchers can now, in the immediate aftermath of an extreme weather event, run the observed conditions through climate models and quantify the degree to which human-caused warming made that event more probable, more intense, or more destructive. The methodology is not perfect. Science never is. But the findings have been consistent enough and replicated enough times that the general conclusions are no longer seriously disputed among the researchers doing the work. The flooding event in the Central Plains that opened our 90-day window, attribution analysis of comparable events in that region, has consistently found that events of that rainfall intensity are now several times more likely to occur than they would have been in a pre-industrial climate. The rapid intensification of tropical systems in the Atlantic and Gulf, the specific atmospheric and oceanic conditions that enable that kind of overnight strengthening, are now measurably more common than they were 50 years ago. The heat dome events in the western United States. Multiple attribution studies have concluded that without the temperature increase already baked into the climate system, some of the extreme heat events we have experienced in recent years would have been virtually impossible, not unlikely, virtually impossible. So why does the unprecedented framing keep getting used? Part of the answer is institutional. Emergency management agencies, insurance companies, infrastructure planning bodies, all of them work on what are called return period estimates. A 100-year flood does not mean a flood that happens once every 100 years in any calendar sense. It means a flood with a 1% probability of occurring in any given year. The problem is that those probability estimates were calculated using historical data from periods when the climate was different from the climate we currently have. When the climate shifts, the return periods shift with it. An event that was genuinely rare under one set of atmospheric conditions becomes considerably less rare under a warmer set of atmospheric conditions. But the planning documents, the building codes, the insurance rate tables, the infrastructure design specifications, they often continue to use the old return periods because updating them is administratively and financially complex. This gap between the current hazard environment and the estimates being used to plan around it is one of the most important and least discussed vulnerabilities in the American infrastructure landscape. It is not that the engineers are unaware of it. They are aware of it. The reports documenting it are not classified. They are published in peer-reviewed journals and in the technical guidance documents of federal agencies. The problem is that closing the gap costs money and requires political decisions that are difficult to make in systems where the people who pay for resilience upgrades now are generally not the same people who will benefit from those upgrades during the next extreme event that would have been much worse without them. That temporal mismatch, the fact that the costs of resilience are immediate while the benefits are realized only when the avoided disaster would otherwise have occurred, is one of the core structural problems in how democratic societies handle long-term physical risk. We are not good at paying for things that prevent events we cannot point to because they did not happen. The levee that held, the hospital that stayed online, the bridge that did not collapse, These are invisible successes. The levee that failed is on the front page. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. The Federal Emergency Management Agency maintains maps that designate flood zones. These maps are the legal basis for flood insurance requirements for homeowners in those zones. They are also a key reference document for local governments making zoning decisions about where development is and is not permitted. The problem that hydrologists have been documenting for years is that a significant number of these maps are outdated. Many of them reflect flood risk estimates from decades ago. They do not account for the changes in precipitation patterns that have occurred since they were drawn. They do not account for changes in land use that have increased runoff. They do not account for the sea level rise that has elevated the baseline flood risk in coastal areas. The practical consequence is that there are people living in homes that are not designated as high-risk flood zones, who have not been required to carry flood insurance, who have not been warned by their local zoning regulations that they are in a high-risk area because the map they are relying on was drawn before the conditions changed. When the flood comes and their neighbourhood goes underwater, they describe it as unprecedented. Their neighbours describe it as unprecedented. The news cameras describe it as unprecedented, and in a narrow technical sense it is. It has not happened before at their specific address. But it was entirely consistent with what updated flood modelling would have predicted if anyone had applied it to their neighbourhood. The gap between the official map and the current reality is not a conspiracy. It is a funding and capacity problem. Updating the flood maps comprehensively would require resources that have not been allocated at the scale the task demands. So the maps remain outdated, the risk remains unacknowledged, and people make decisions about where to buy homes and how much insurance to carry and how seriously to take evacuation orders based on information that no longer accurately reflects the hazard they face. This is the infrastructure of uncertainty. It is as important as the physical infrastructure of bridges and levees, and it is in comparable disrepair. Now let us shift the frame, because everything we have talked about so far has been predominantly physical. The storms, the fires, the floods, the heat. But disasters are not only physical events, they are social events. They reveal the structure of society in ways that ordinary times conceal. And one of the most consistent and most sobering patterns in disaster research is the degree to which the damage from any given extreme event is not distributed randomly or equally across the population it strikes. After every major disaster, if you map the damage against the demographic and economic characteristics of the affected area, the pattern is almost always the same. The neighbourhoods that sustained the worst damage were the ones with older housing stock that was not built to current code. They were the neighbourhoods with fewer resources to invest in hardening individual properties against the hazard. They were the neighbourhoods where residents were more likely to be renters rather than owners, and therefore had less control over the resilience of their housing. They were the neighbourhoods where residents had less access to the social networks and financial resources that enable rapid evacuation when warning is given. They were the neighbourhoods that had been built in locations, often low-lying, often adjacent to industrial sites, often in the path of floodwaters, that reflected historical patterns of where lower-income communities were permitted to develop when higher-ground real estate was less accessible to them. Disaster researchers call this the social vulnerability dimension of hazard risk. It is not the same thing as saying that disasters are caused by poverty. They are not. But poverty and inequality shape how much damage a given physical event causes and how completely and how quickly people are able to recover from it. A family that owns their home outright and has savings and a strong insurance policy and multiple other residences to retreat to during recovery experiences a hurricane very differently from a family that was renting month to month, had no flood insurance because it was not required in their officially designated zone, had no savings buffer, and had no alternative place to stay when their home became uninhabitable. The hurricane did not discriminate between them, but the hurricane's consequences did. This dynamic is not new. What is new is the frequency with which it is being demonstrated. In the 90-day window we tracked, the communities that sustained the most severe damage relative to the intensity of the event that struck them were, in case after case, communities where the underlying social vulnerability was already high. That is not coincidence. That is the amplification effect of inequality operating on physical hazard. Recovery is where this amplification plays out over the longest timescale. Federal disaster assistance programs exist to help communities rebuild after major declared disasters. They have helped enormous numbers of people. but the structure of those programs, in ways that have been documented extensively in the disaster policy literature, tends to accelerate recovery for homeowners with more resources and slow it for renters and lower-income households. The documentation requirements, the appeals processes, the requirement to have a pre-existing mortgage to qualify for certain types of assistance, the preference in some programs for home repair rather than rental assistance, all of these features, individually defensible on administrative grounds, collectively produce an outcome where the people most severely harmed by a disaster are often the slowest to recover from it, and in some cases never fully do. Hurricane Katrina demonstrated this dynamic at a scale that was impossible to ignore. 2 decades later, researchers studying the long-term recovery patterns in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast still find evidence of it in the data. The population that returned to the most severely damaged neighborhoods is smaller than the population that was displaced. The communities that were hardest hit suffered the greatest long-term population loss. The wealth that left during the storm was not uniformly replaced when rebuilding occurred. These are not observations about a single extraordinary event. They are observations about a structural pattern that repeats whenever a major disaster strikes a socially stratified society. The 90-day window is the acute story. The decades-long recovery arc is the chronic one. Both are part of the same pattern. There is something else operating in the background of all of this that deserves its own examination, and it is something that most disaster coverage never gets around to discussing. That is the question of what it costs. Not the emotional cost, though that is real and immeasurable, the dollar cost, the financial arithmetic of a country that is absorbing disasters at the rate and with the clustering that the 90-day window documented. The United States has, over the past several decades, seen a dramatic increase in the annual cost of weather-related disasters. The data is kept by the National Centers for Environmental Information, which tracks billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, meaning events that individually cause at least $1 billion in damage. In the 1980s, the United States averaged roughly 3 such events per year. In the 1990s, roughly 6. In the 2000s, roughly 12. In the 2010s, roughly 15. In the years since 2020, the annual average has run above 20. This is not entirely an inflation story. Even adjusting for economic growth and changes in the dollar's purchasing power, the trend is sharply upward. And it is not entirely a population story, meaning more people and more development in harm's way, though that is a real contributing factor. The increase in the frequency and severity of the events themselves is a significant driver. The warmer, more energized climate system is producing more costly events more frequently, and the cost curve has not peaked. The financial consequences of this trend flow through the economy in ways that are distributed and often invisible. Federal disaster relief appropriations come out of the federal budget, which means they are ultimately paid through taxes or debt. The insurance industry, which is the primary mechanism through which private economic losses are spread, has been struggling with the implications of the trend for years. Major insurance carriers have been withdrawing from high-risk markets. Florida, historically one of the most active markets for homeowners insurance in the country, has seen a series of major insurers decline to write new policies or exit the state entirely in recent years, citing the growing impossibility of writing profitable policies at premiums that policyholders can afford to pay. The insurers who remain have raised premiums sharply. Homeowners in coastal Florida are now paying premiums that can exceed $10,000 per year for a modest home in a high-risk zone. What happens when insurance becomes unaffordable? Some homeowners go uninsured, accepting the full financial risk of a disaster onto their personal balance sheet. Others, particularly those with mortgages, are required by their lenders to carry insurance regardless of cost, and the insurance premium becomes a financial strain that can push households to the edge of affordability or over it. In markets where home values are closely tied to insurability, the withdrawal of insurance availability can undermine property values, reducing the wealth of homeowners who have done nothing wrong except own property in a place that the climate has made newly risky. This is happening in real time. It is not hypothetical. It is being documented quarter by quarter in the financial disclosures of insurance companies and in the economic data from affected housing markets. The state insurance program of last resort in Florida, Citizens Property Insurance, which exists to cover homeowners who cannot get private coverage, has grown dramatically in recent years as private carriers have retreated. It now insures more than 1 million policies. It is, by multiple measures, underfunded relative to its potential exposure in a major hurricane season. The risk has not been eliminated. It has been transferred to the state, to the taxpayers. The same dynamic is playing out in the wildfire-prone areas of California. The same dynamic is beginning to emerge in coastal markets along the Gulf of Mexico and in flood-prone river communities in the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic. The insurance industry, which exists precisely to spread and manage catastrophic risk, is reaching the limits of its capacity to do so at a price point that the market can bear. That is not a failure of insurance. That is the insurance market performing exactly as designed and telling us something specific. The risk has grown beyond what the existing financial architecture was built to handle. What replaces it is the question that nobody in positions of financial authority particularly wants to answer out loud, because the honest answer involves some combination of dramatically higher insurance costs, large-scale managed retreat from the highest risk areas, massive public investment in physical resilience infrastructure, or some reckoning with the idea that in some places, the combination of risk and cost has become so extreme that continued development and habitation of those places may not be economically or physically sustainable over the relevant time frame. That last option, managed retreat, is the one that generates the most political resistance, for understandable reasons. People live in these places. They have built their lives there, their communities, their social networks, their livelihoods are there. The idea that they should simply leave, that the appropriate response to unbearable risk is to abandon what they have built, runs against something deep in the American relationship to land and place and self-determination. It also runs against the economic reality that for most American households, the home is the primary store of wealth. Telling someone to abandon their home is not a neutral economic suggestion. But managed retreat is already happening. It is just happening chaotically and inequitably rather than in a planned and supported way. It is happening when a family that cannot afford to rebuild after the third flood moves away and does not come back. It is happening when renters displaced by a disaster never find affordable replacement housing in the same community. It is happening when a business that loses its lease after a hurricane does not reopen in the same neighborhood. Retreat is occurring. It is the management part that is absent. And the absence of management means the retreat is bearing down hardest on the people with the fewest resources to navigate it. The communities that need managed retreat policy most urgently are, almost by definition, the communities with the least political voice to demand it or shape how it operates. This is one of the most acute tensions in the developing disaster policy landscape, and it does not have an easy resolution. Let us look at something specific that illustrates the scale of the problem from a different angle. After the major flooding events in the central United States over the past decade, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's hazard mitigation programs have purchased and demolished thousands of homes in the highest risk flood zones. The former homeowners received buyouts. The land they vacated was converted to open space or wetlands, restoring some of the natural flood-absorbing capacity of the landscape. By any measure of disaster risk reduction, this is sensible policy. Removing people and structures from the places that flood repeatedly prevents the repeated cycle of damage and federal recovery spending that would otherwise continue indefinitely. The problem is that the buyout programs have historically been underfunded, slow, and inconsistently targeted. The offers made to homeowners are often less than the homeowners believe their properties are worth, even after accounting for the flood risk discount. The process takes years, during which homeowners are living in damaged property while waiting for a resolution. And because buyouts are voluntary, the result is often Swiss cheese patterns of development, where some families on a flood-prone street accepted buyouts, and their lots are now open space, while other families on the same street declined, and their homes remain, in some cases more isolated and more difficult to protect than they were before the buyout program operated. None of this is a critique of the intention behind the programs. The intention is correct. It is a description of what happens when a policy response is scaled to the size of the political will to fund it, rather than the size of the actual problem. The gap between what the programs can do and what the risk environment demands has widened considerably as disaster frequency has increased. There is a number that sits at the center of all of these converging pressures, and it is worth naming directly. The Congressional Budget Office and several independent research organizations have looked at the long-term trajectory of federal disaster spending, and concluded that under current trends, disaster-related federal expenditures are going to continue rising substantially for the foreseeable future. The models differ in their specific projections. What they agree on is the direction. The question for federal fiscal planners is not whether disaster costs are going to increase. It is how much, how fast, and what else in the federal budget has to give to accommodate them. This is the point at which the physical reality of a changing hazard environment collides with the political reality of constrained budgets and competing priorities. Every dollar spent on disaster recovery is a dollar not spent on something else. Every year in which recovery costs increase is a year in which the discretionary resources available for proactive investment in resilience shrink relative to the reactive demands of the disaster cycle. There is a feedback loop here that does not favour good outcomes if allowed to run unchecked. Proactive investment in resilience, upgrading the grid before the extreme heat event rather than repairing it afterward, hardening coastal infrastructure before the storm rather than rebuilding after it, revising building codes before the next tornado outbreak rather than counting the dead after it. Proactive investment is almost always cheaper than reactive recovery. The economics of that comparison have been studied extensively, and the finding is consistent. Every dollar invested in hazard mitigation before a disaster saves on average between $4 and $7 in avoided recovery costs. But those savings are hypothetical at the moment of the investment decision. The recovery costs are real and immediate after the disaster. The political incentive structure in most systems rewards visible action in response to visible crisis. It is much harder to generate political credit for the disaster that did not happen, for the flood that the upgraded levee held back, for the grid that did not cascade because the transformers were hardened, for the communities that did not burn because the defensible space requirements were enforced. The political economy of preventive investment in disaster resilience is genuinely hard, and anyone who dismisses the difficulty is not grappling seriously with the problem. This does not mean it cannot be done. It has been done. Specific targeted federal and state investments in flood control infrastructure, in wildfire fuel management, in building code reforms have demonstrably reduced damage in subsequent disaster events. The National Flood Insurance Programme's community rating system, which provides insurance premium discounts to communities that go beyond minimum floodplain management standards, has created incentives that have resulted in real flood damage reductions in participating communities. These are not small accomplishments. They are evidence that the problem is not intractable. What they are not is sufficient to the current scale of the challenge. The investment levels that have been achieved are meaningful. They are not remotely proportional to what the data on hazard trends suggests is required. The gap between the two, the gap between what has been done and what needs to be done, is one of the central facts of American infrastructure and public safety in this period. Let me take you somewhere specific now, because I want to move from the large-scale abstract to the level where real people are making real decisions under real pressure. Because that is ultimately where this story lives, not in the FEMA reports or the insurance actuarial tables, though those matter, in the actual human choices that are being made or not made in the face of this pattern. A few years ago, researchers looking at US-based census data found something that, at first glance, looks paradoxical. Internal migration patterns in the United States show that Americans have been moving, in net terms, toward the riskiest climatic areas rather than away from them. The counties gaining the most population from in-migration have, on average, higher heat risk, higher wildfire risk, and higher flood risk than the counties losing population. Phoenix has been one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country for decades, adding residents who will live through summers of 115-degree heat and depend on a water supply from a river system that multiple studies have found is likely to face significant long-term strain. Florida's coastal counties have been absorbing population even as hurricane risk and flood insurance costs have escalated. The wildland-urban interface, the firefighters' term for the zone where human development meets fire-prone landscape, has continued to expand even as the fires in those zones have grown more destructive. Why? The reasons are multiple, and they are not irrational from the perspective of the individuals making the decisions. Affordable housing, particularly for working families, is increasingly scarce in the major coastal metropolitan areas that have historically been centers of economic opportunity. The urban cores of New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston have become extraordinarily expensive. The affordability that exists in many Sunbelt and inland communities comes partly as a reflection of lower land values that, in turn, reflect higher physical risk. A family that cannot afford to buy in the Bay Area or in Greater Boston may find that Phoenix or Houston or Charlotte offers both employment opportunity and home ownership that is financially within reach. The climate risk is real, but it is abstract, and the affordability is immediate and concrete. This is not a failure of individual judgment, it is a failure of the information environment and the pricing environment in which those judgments are being made. If risk is not priced into property, if hazard information is not prominently disclosed at the point of purchase, if the long-term trajectory of insurance costs and flood risk and heat burden is not part of the standard conversation in a real estate transaction, then the market signals available to a home buyer are systematically incomplete. People cannot factor in risks they have not been told about. Some states have improved hazard disclosure requirements in recent years. California, after a devastating series of wildfire seasons, strengthened requirements for disclosing fire hazard severity zone designations to prospective home buyers. Florida has requirements around flood zone disclosure that, while still criticized by consumer advocates as inadequate, are more comprehensive than in many other states. But the patchwork nature of these requirements means that the degree of risk information available to a home buyer varies enormously, depending on where they are buying and whether their real estate agent is forthcoming about issues that might complicate the transaction. The real estate industry has not historically been a leading voice for comprehensive hazard disclosure. The reasons are obvious. Comprehensive disclosure of flood risk, fire risk, heat risk, and the trajectory of insurance costs in a high-risk area can make transactions more complicated and can reduce property values in high-risk neighborhoods. Agents work on commission from completed sales. The incentive structure does not naturally favor comprehensive disclosure of information that makes sales less likely or less profitable. This is changing slowly as the consequences of inadequate disclosure become more visible and as liability questions become more pressing. But the change is slower than the hazard environment is evolving. There is a population in this story that has been present throughout but has not been named directly. It is the people who are paid to think about this full time, not the politicians, who have to win elections every 2 to 6 years and whose time horizons are constrained accordingly. Not the executives whose performance metrics are typically measured quarterly or annually. The people whose professional obligation is to look out across decades and assess the long-term stability of the systems they manage. These people exist. They work in the infrastructure divisions of federal agencies, in the planning departments of major utilities, in the engineering offices of large municipalities, in the analytical divisions of insurance companies and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. They produce reports. Those reports are frequently alarming. They are often not the reports that get the most attention in the coverage of a given disaster season, but they are the reports that are closest to the actual long-term risk picture. The actuaries at major insurance companies have been incorporating climate risk into their modelling for years, and the models have been consistently telling them things that have now shown up in the premium increases and market withdrawals we have already discussed. The engineers at major utilities have been documenting the inadequacy of current grid infrastructure to handle the combination of increasing peak demand from extreme heat and increasing risk of physical damage from extreme weather for at least a decade. The Army Corps of Engineers has been cataloguing the deferred maintenance backlog on the nation's flood control infrastructure since long before the current disaster season began. These assessments exist. They circulate within the institutions that produce them. They occasionally make it into the supplementary materials of congressional hearings or the technical appendices of federal budget documents. What they have not done, with some notable exceptions, is generate the political response that their findings would seem to demand. The reason, again, comes back to timing. The assessments describe risks that will fully materialize over timescales of decades. The political system operates on cycles of years. The incentive to make the costly investment that is necessary to avoid the costly consequence that will arrive on a future administration's watch is simply not strong enough, in most institutional contexts, to overcome the competing pressures on current budgets. There is a technical term in economics for this problem. It is called hyperbolic discounting. The human tendency to value immediate rewards much more heavily than future rewards, even when the future rewards are substantially larger. It is a well-documented feature of human decision-making at the individual level. It also operates at the institutional and political level, and when it operates at the scale of national infrastructure decisions, the consequences are visible in the pattern we have been tracking through 90 days and beyond. But here is something worth holding on to. Hyperbolic discounting is not destiny. There are historical examples of societies making very large upfront investments to prevent future catastrophes that were not immediate. The interstate highway system, the rural electrification program. The Eisenhower-era investment in the interstate dam and water management infrastructure of the western United States. These were costly, they were politically contested, and they were undertaken because a sufficient coalition of political will was assembled to support them. What generated that political will? In each case, the combination of visible recent catastrophe, compelling evidence of future risk, and a policy entrepreneur capable of translating both into a political coalition that could move legislation and budget. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 created the political conditions for the massive federal investment in Mississippi River flood control that followed. The Dust Bowl, combined with the New Deal political moment, generated the impetus for the soil conservation and land management programs that reduced topsoil erosion. None of these precedents are perfect. Some of them created their own unintended consequences, but they demonstrate that the political constraints on large-scale resilience investment are not immovable. The 90-day window we documented, the trajectory of disaster costs, the insurance market signals, the engineering assessments, the attribution science findings, all of these together represent a body of evidence comparable in its clarity to the evidence that preceded the previous moments when large-scale collective action on physical risk was undertaken. The question is whether a political coalition capable of translating that evidence into action will form quickly enough to matter. I want to spend some time now on something that tends to get lost in the disaster-by-disaster coverage, and even in the policy-level analysis. That is the human cognitive and psychological dimension of living through a period of elevated and sustained hazard. There is a body of psychological research on what happens to people who experience repeated traumatic events without adequate recovery time between them. The clinical literature on disaster-related trauma has developed substantially in the decades since researchers began studying the psychological aftermath of major disasters systematically. What that literature has found, consistently, is that the recovery arc from disaster-related psychological trauma is significantly affected by the resources available to the affected person and community, by the degree of social connection and community cohesion that survived the event, and by whether the person has a credible narrative about the future, some basis for believing that rebuilding is possible, and that the event was an aberration rather than a preview of a new normal. That last factor, the credibility of the narrative about the future, is increasingly difficult to maintain for people who live in disaster-prone areas and who are experiencing the kind of repeated, closely spaced events that characterized our 90-day window. A family that has flooded twice in 5 years, that has watched their insurance premium triple and their buyout offer fall short of what they owe on their mortgage, that has neighbours who have moved away and show no signs of returning, that families' ability to construct a credible, optimistic narrative about rebuilding and staying is genuinely compromised. That is not a personal failing. That is an accurate perception of a difficult situation. Chronic stress from sustained environmental threat produces measurable effects on physical and mental health. Research on communities living under persistent drought conditions, on populations living adjacent to chronic industrial hazard, on residents of neighbourhoods with high rates of environmental health risk, consistently finds elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and stress-related physical health conditions compared to comparable populations in lower-risk environments. The psychological burden of living in a place that is repeatedly threatened is not trivial. It is an ongoing cost that does not show up in the disaster damage assessments, but is real and cumulative for the people bearing it. Emergency managers and public health professionals who work in repeatedly struck communities describe what they sometimes call disaster fatigue, a phenomenon where the psychological and organizational resources that communities mobilize in response to the first major event are reduced in subsequent events because they have not fully recovered. The volunteers are more depleted. The local organizations that coordinate immediate response are dealing with their own institutional stress from the previous event. Community leaders, who are themselves disaster survivors, are less able to perform the leadership functions their communities need from them. The response to disaster number 3 is less robust than the response to disaster number 1, not because the community cares less, but because the reserves are being drawn down. This is another form of the compounding problem. Compound financial damage, compound infrastructure damage, compound institutional capacity damage, compound psychological damage. They are all happening simultaneously to the same communities. There is a word that has been used frequently in climate and disaster policy circles for the better part of 2 decades now, and I want to address it directly because I think it has become in some ways, counterproductive. That word is resilience. Communities need to build resilience. Infrastructure needs to be made more resilient. Society needs to develop resilience in the face of increased climate risk. The word appears in nearly every policy document, every strategic plan, every grant program related to disaster preparedness and climate adaptation. The problem with the word is not the concept. The concept is correct. Systems, communities, and infrastructure that are better able to absorb disturbance and return to function are genuinely better positioned to navigate the hazard environment we are entering. The problem is that resilience has been deployed in ways that can shift the moral weight of the disaster problem onto the people least able to bear it. If communities need to build resilience, and they do not have the resources to build resilience because they have been chronically underinvested, then the implicit message is that the suffering that results from the next disaster is a consequence of their failure to be resilient enough. That framing inverts the actual responsibility structure. Individual communities and households did not create the conditions driving the intensification of the disaster pattern we documented in our 90-day window. They are not going to adapt their way out of it through individual resilience building if the systemic conditions remain unchanged. Resilience at the household level, prudent as it is not a substitute for adequately funded and maintained public infrastructure. Resilience at the community level is not a substitute for honest hazard mapping and disclosure. Individual preparedness, important as it is, does not substitute for a functioning insurance market and equitable disaster recovery programs. Resilience is necessary but not sufficient, and the discourse around it is healthiest when it is honest about what it can and cannot accomplish. Let me take you to a different scale now. Not the individual household, not the community, not even the national system. Let me take you to the international dimension of what we have been tracking. Because the 90-day pattern we documented in the United States is not occurring in isolation. It is occurring within a global context that shapes what it means and what it demands. Every nation on Earth with a sophisticated weather monitoring and climate science infrastructure is producing its own version of this pattern. The European Union has documented an escalating series of extreme heat events, river floods, and wildfire seasons across southern and central Europe over the past decade. Australia, before any of the 90 days we tracked in the United States, experienced a fire season of such extraordinary scale that the smoke from it was tracked crossing the Pacific and contributing to haze over South America. The Indian subcontinent has seen monsoon flooding events that have displaced millions of people. Sub-Saharan Africa faces compounding drought and flooding extremes. The island nations of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean face sea level rise trajectories that, under current projections, will make some of them uninhabitable within this century. The United States, in other words, is not experiencing something unique. It is experiencing its local version of a planetary scale transformation. That framing matters for one specific and important reason. It means that some of the future consequences of this transformation will arrive not directly through storms or fires or floods, but through the secondary effects of what the same processes are doing to other places. Agricultural systems in other parts of the world that are major sources of food for global markets are experiencing stress. When the wheat belt of Central Asia has a failed season due to drought and extreme heat, global wheat prices respond. When monsoon failures reduce rice yields in major producing regions, the global food system feels it. The United States is both a major agricultural producer with its own exposure to climate-related agricultural stress, and a major consumer of agricultural products from global supply chains that are exposed to the same kinds of extreme events the 90-day window documented domestically. The resilience of global food supply chains to the simultaneous occurrence of climate-driven agricultural shocks in multiple major producing regions has been assessed as significantly less than the global food system's current complexity might suggest. The interconnections that make global food systems efficient also make them brittle in the face of synchronized shocks. The displacement of people from places made increasingly uninhabitable by extreme heat, flooding, failed agriculture, and other climate consequences is already contributing to global migration pressures. The projections for future decades suggest this will intensify significantly. The geopolitical implications of very large-scale displacement are beyond the scope of any single analysis, but the general direction is not difficult to infer. Societies and political systems that are already under stress from other sources do not generally handle very large influxes of climate-displaced people with equanimity. The potential for conflict, for political instability, for humanitarian crisis, in the regions where climate displacement becomes most severe is real, and it is already beginning to materialize in some parts of the world. None of this is speculative in the sense of being uncertain whether it will happen. The uncertainty is in the magnitude and the pace. The direction is clear. The United States, as one of the world's largest historical emitters of greenhouse gases, bears a particular relationship to this global picture that is simultaneously scientific and moral. The physics connecting historical emissions to current and future warming is well understood. The distribution of who emitted those gases over the past century and a half is well documented. The correlation between the pattern of emissions and the pattern of national wealth that the fossil fuel economy generated is clear. The correlation between that pattern and the distribution of who is currently suffering the worst consequences of the warming those emissions produced is, in some regions of the world, deeply uncomfortable if examined honestly. This is the dimension of the disaster pattern that the insurance actuarial tables and the infrastructure engineering reports do not capture. It is the ethical dimension, and while it does not have a simple resolution, it deserves to be named as part of the complete picture. The international climate negotiation process, which has been ongoing in various forms since the early 1990s, has generated a series of agreements that have moved the needle on global emissions trajectories to a meaningful degree. The acceleration in renewable energy deployment globally over the past decade, the declining cost curve of solar and wind generation, the increasing electrification of transportation in several major markets, these are real developments. They represent a genuine inflection in the energy trajectory from what it would have been without them. The emissions pathway the world is now on is materially better than the pathway it was on 10 years ago. It is not, however, a pathway that keeps the already changed conditions from getting worse. The physics is clear here too. The warming that is already in the system, produced by the emissions already in the atmosphere, will continue to manifest in more intense events for decades, even under the most optimistic emissions scenario going forward. The question now is not how to avoid the changes that have already begun. That window is closed. The question is how severe the ultimate change will be, which depends on future emissions choices, and what systems and capacities we build to navigate what is already locked in. Those two questions are not separate. The investment in emissions reduction and the investment in adaptation and resilience are both necessary. Focusing exclusively on emissions without adaptation leaves communities exposed to the intensifying hazard environment, while the emissions reductions work their way through the atmospheric system over decades. Focusing exclusively on adaptation without emissions, reduction is adapting to a moving target that keeps getting worse. Both are required simultaneously at scale sustained over decades. This is asking a great deal of human institutions. It requires sustained political will across multiple election cycles. It requires large upfront investments with benefits distributed over long timescales. It requires international cooperation among nations with competing interests. It requires changes in individual behavior embedded in economic systems with powerful incentives for existing behavior. These requirements, separately and together, have historically been among the most challenging things that human political and economic systems have been asked to deliver. And yet, the infrastructure of modern industrial society, the electrical grids, the transportation networks, the water systems, the agricultural systems, the communication systems, was not built in a generation. It was built over a century through a sustained combination of public investment, regulatory framework, technological innovation, and market development. The decarbonisation and resilience transformation that the current hazard environment demands is a comparable undertaking, not in the sense that it is comfortable or easy, but in the sense that human societies have successfully undertaken transformations of comparable scale and complexity before. The difference, and it is a real difference, is time. The industrial infrastructure was built over a century. The transformation now required needs to move considerably faster than that, because the hazard environment is not stable while the transformation proceeds. The urgency is not rhetorical, it is physical. Let me come back to something local, something close, because this story began with specific events in specific places, and it should come to rest there. There is a family in Kentucky, let us call them what they are without naming them, a family like many in that region, who watched the floodwaters rise in the early spring event that opened our 90-day window. They had lived in their house for 30 years. It had never flooded. They had no flood insurance because the map said they were not in a flood zone. The water reached the ceiling of their first floor. Everything they owned was destroyed. Their home was structurally compromised. Their insurance company covered wind damage but not flood damage. They applied for federal assistance. After several months and multiple appeals, they received assistance that covered a fraction of their losses. They are, at the time I'm describing, still in the process of figuring out what comes next. That family did not cause the conditions that produced that flood. They were not responsible for the atmospheric river that carried the moisture, or the sea surface temperatures that fed it, or the decades of emissions that drove those temperatures upward. They were living where they had always lived, doing what people do, and an event that the official map said was not supposed to happen, happened and destroyed 30 years of accumulated life. There are thousands of families like them across the 90-day window we tracked, in coastal Georgia, in the Texas Panhandle. On the landslide-cut communities in the Cascades, in the neighborhoods along the Gulf Coast that the moderate storm surge reached, each of them is navigating the aftermath of an event they did not choose and could not have fully prepared for, in a system of information and financial support and institutional response that was designed for a different, less stressed version of the hazard environment than the one that now exists. The gap between what those families needed and what the system provided is not an argument against the system. It is an argument for improving the system at the pace and scale the current hazard environment requires. The system can be improved, the maps can be updated, the disclosure requirements can be strengthened, the insurance programs can be restructured, the building codes can be reformed. The infrastructure can be hardened, the warning systems can be extended. None of these things are technically beyond reach. They require the decision to do them, and that decision requires something that the pattern of our 90-day window is, in the most essential terms, an argument for. It requires an honest accounting of what is actually happening, not the unprecedented framing that isolates each event as an anomaly, not the political language that defers the hard choices to the next administration, not the institutional inertia that updates the risk maps on the timeline of administrative convenience rather than the timeline of the hazard. An honest accounting of the pattern, what it is, why it is happening, what it means for the future, and what investment of resources and political will it demands from the present. The 90 days we tracked are documented history now. The events occurred, the damage happened, the families are in recovery, the gaps are visible, the pattern is clear. The next 90 days are already in progress, and the 90 days after those. Each set of 90 days is a new opportunity to narrow the gap between the system as it is and the system that the hazard environment requires. Each set is also a demonstration that the gap has not yet been closed if the response remains at current scale. The planet is not waiting for the political process to catch up. The atmospheric system does not observe fiscal years or legislative calendars. The physics operates continuously. The question is not whether the events are going to keep coming. They are. The question is what we choose to build, to fund, to reform, and to protect in the time we have before the next ones arrive. The families in Kentucky who watched the water rise did not choose the pattern. They are living inside it. So, at different levels of exposure and vulnerability, is every community that any of the events in our 90-day window touched. So, are the communities that were not touched this time and will be next time, or the time after. The pattern is not a verdict. Patterns can be responded to. Systems can be improved. Investments can be made. Policies can change. Communities can be given better information, better financial tools, better physical protection. Managed retreat, where it is necessary, can be conducted with equity and support rather than chaotic abandonment. Warning systems can be extended further ahead of the events they warn about. Infrastructure can be hardened before the event rather than repaired after. None of this erases the 90 days we documented, but it shapes what the next 90 days look like. And the 90 days after those. Each iteration is not simply a repeat. It is an opportunity to demonstrate that the society absorbing these events has learned from them, invested in response to them, and closed some portion of the gap between the system it has and the system the current and future hazard environment requires. That is the argument the pattern is making. In every flooded basement and burned ridgeline and buckled road and shell-shocked community that appeared in our accounting. Not that disaster is inevitable and overwhelming and nothing can be done. The opposite. that the shape of future disasters, how severe they are, how many people they kill, how many families they displace, how much wealth they destroy, how many communities they scatter, that shape is not fixed. It is responsive to investment, to policy, to the decisions being made or not made in the spaces between the events. The 90 days are over. The next 90 have already begun. What they look like on the other end depends in no small part on what is decided now.